Right, so here we're doing 1.5 system software, and of course we'll start with 1.5.1 and operating system. So an operating system is basically a collection of programs or software that interface between the hardware and the software. They basically control all the hardware and the software on the computer. Without it, it would be very difficult for computers to run, and you wouldn't be able to use any of the hardware you've got. So one of the main things an operating system does is do the user interface. So the user interface is basically how the user interacts. What do we see? So here I'm using Windows 10. So obviously this is a graphical user interface like Windows, Android, macOS, iOS. Okay, but you do get the command line ones like MS-DOS. You can obviously run a command prompt if you know what that means in your desktop. But here we go. That's a command line prompt. So that's where you type with the command line. They are sometimes still used today in various situations, which we'll go through in a minute. Because they do have their advantages, even command line somewhat has. So here's the basic. I'm not going to go through each one because it's kind of obvious what a description is. Obviously, the command line is a lot more difficult to use because you have to know the commands you're typing in. It's not like you can just sort of, well, you could guess a little bit. But with obviously a graphical user interface, you can sort of try and figure things out and it's a lot easier to use. You have a lot more control over the operating system in command line because you've got direct communication to it, less so in a GUI, although that can be slightly overstated here, I think. So command line interfaces do use less power, which can be useful. And by power, I mean electricity as well as processing power, because they don't have to do the graphical element. And if you're doing something like hosting a web server and there's no need to have a screen on even, then why would you have an operating system like Windows loaded in the background just eating up resources for no reason? So yeah, obviously the appearance of the command line interface can't be changed very much, whereas in a visual one you can obviously edit the appearance quite a lot and obviously attune it to your own personal tastes. So that's user interface. So we're going to go on to memory management and multitasking, but I'll start with memory management. So the operating system is in charge of allocating the memory for the programs when they open. The whole point of this is a programmer doesn't need to know where in memory data is held. It's the operating system's job to allocate all the memory for the program. This is quite useful because otherwise it would get really annoying when you're the programmer trying to figure out where everything is. So basically you create something, like for example in Python, you create some variables. You don't really need to know where they are in memory, that name equals input, whatever. It is just somewhere in memory and you need to know that you can use it again by using the word name. That's basically it. But there are other things. I'm simplifying that somewhat. So multitasking. Okay. Basically, this is really common sense, and you probably all know this, that instead of doing each task until it's completed, you do a little bit of each task really quickly, one after the other, and it gives the impression that the computer is doing lots of things at once, but in fact it's not. Obviously, if we have more than one core, we are doing more than one things at once, but let's simplify this and presume it's a single core CPU, and then we're essentially doing a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and they're doing it so quickly that it appears as if we're doing four things at once, but really we're just doing a little bit of all of them very quickly. So peripheral management, okay. Basically, any peripheral is anything you plug in, keyboard or mouse. It's hardware that's not directly connected to the CPU. And basically, the operating system is in charge of managing those, interacting with those devices. Basically, not going to talk much about that because it's kind of obvious. Device driver, you should know by now, is a piece of software that is used to control the hardware. It essentially teaches the operating system how to talk to the hardware. And because it teaches the operating system how to talk to the hardware, it is operating system specific. That means you would need a Linux driver for a keyboard as well as a Windows driver. But many of the operating systems have built-in ones for the more well-known hardware devices or the standard devices. But they may not have all the features. For example, a keyboard might work, but you can't change the fancy lights you've got on it because that's specific to that keyboard. Okay, they obviously get regularly updated and they're created by the companies that make the devices, not the operating system people themselves. So user management, okay, just remember this one, that the operating system enables different users to log on and the settings are kept for each one. Okay, so you know if you set something up and you log back in, it's kind of there. The network admin can allocate accounts to users and he set access rights. So for example, you might not have access to write to the C drive or whatever, which you don't. You can't install software. So it's the rights for different users, you know, the hierarchy of rights. And yeah, so user access levels, if you want the fancy term, where users have different access to different things. That's what's done there. And security is managed by the user management of the operating system, so enabling the security of their account, etc., etc. File management. Like memory management, the operating system identifies where files are stored, so you don't have to worry about it too much. You need to know the path to it, but not the specific point on the secondary storage. So you don't need to worry about where to. I haven't got to literally say, oh, write a 0 there, write a 1 there. I just say save a file to this folder, and the operating system saves the file. Other features of it, obviously naming of files, allocating to folders, creating, moving, copying, modifying, deleting files, and the operating system gives you the ability to search for files. So yeah, that's quite a few useful things that the operating system does, and that's that section done.